True road trip horror stories script 1, The Desolate Detour. It was supposed to be an exciting summer road trip, a getaway from the mundane routine of everyday life. Mark and Jenna had planned this trip for months. They had mapped out every stop, every scenic view, and every quirky roadside attraction. The open road promised adventure, and they were eager to embrace every mile. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, they found themselves far from their planned route, thanks to a detour sign they hadn't anticipated. The highway they had been traveling on was closed for construction, forcing them to take an unfamiliar back road. At first, it seemed like a minor inconvenience. The detour road was narrow and winding, cutting through thick woods. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization, just endless trees that seemed to close in around them as they drove deeper into the wilderness. "What if we turn around and try to find another way?" Jenna suggested, her voice tinged with unease. Mark, trying to maintain his composure, shook his head. "The GPS says this road will get us back on track in a few miles. We'll be fine," he assured her. But as they continued, the road grew rougher, with potholes jarring the car with every bump. The trees grew thicker, their branches nearly touching above the road, blocking out the last rays of the setting sun. They drove for what felt like hours, the road seeming to stretch on endlessly. The GPS signal had been lost long ago and their phones had no service. Mark's confidence began to wane as the road ahead disappeared into the night. There were no signs, no lights, nothing but the suffocating darkness and the oppressive silence of the forest. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. Mark and Jenna exchanged worried glances as the vehicle coasted to a stop. Mark tried the ignition several times, but the car wouldn't start. The only sounds were the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant call of some nocturnal creature in the woods. "We should have just turned back," Jenna whispered, fear evident in her voice. Mark didn't respond, instead reaching for his flashlight. "I'll check under the hood." "Maybe it's something simple," he said, trying to sound optimistic. He stepped out of the car into the darkness, the flashlight beam cutting through the pitch-black night. As he popped the hood and leaned in, Jenna's heart raced. The silence was unnerving. She glanced around, trying to see through the dark, but the forest was impenetrable. Mark fiddled with the engine for a few minutes, then slammed the hood shut in frustration. "I can't figure it out," he admitted. "We're stuck." The realization hit them both at once. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no idea where they were. The road, which had seemed like a minor detour, now felt like a trap. "We can't just sit here all night," Jenna said, panic rising in her voice. "What if we walk back? Maybe we'll find a house or another road," Mark suggested. Jenna hesitated but knew they had no better option. They grabbed their backpacks, packing what little food and water they had, and set off down the road, the flashlight flickering ominously. The walk was grueling. The darkness was oppressive, and every rustle in the bushes made them jump. The road was rough underfoot, and the trees loomed tall and menacing. Hours passed, and they saw no signs of life, no lights, no houses, nothing. It was as if the road had swallowed them whole. Their nerves were frayed, and their minds played tricks on them. Jenna was sure she saw shadows moving between the trees, and Mark thought he heard footsteps behind them, but whenever they turned, there was nothing. They were utterly alone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they saw a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through them as they quickened their pace. The light grew brighter, revealing a small cabin nestled among the trees. Relief washed over them as they approached, the thought of shelter and safety pushing their fear aside. But as they neared the cabin, something felt wrong. The light was dim and flickering, and the cabin looked old and abandoned. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. Mark hesitated, but Jenna, desperate for some sign of life, pushed ahead. Inside, the cabin was cold and empty. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung in the corners. The light came from a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was no sign of anyone living there, no signs of life at all. It was as if the cabin had been abandoned for years, yet the light was still on. "We shouldn't be here," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But before they could turn to go, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the light went out. Panic set in as they fumbled in the dark, trying to find the door. But the cabin seemed to shift around them, the walls closing in, the air growing colder. Whispers filled the darkness, low and unintelligible, but filled with malice. They finally found the door and burst out into the night, running blindly down the road, their hearts pounding in their chests. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more menacing, until they were a deafening roar in their ears. They didn't stop running until they reached the car, gasping for breath, their minds reeling from what had just happened. But as they reached the car, they realized something was horribly wrong. The car wasn't where they had left it. It was further down the road, its headlights on, the engine running. And sitting in the driver's seat was a figure, its face obscured by the darkness. As they watched, the figure slowly turned its head towards them, revealing a pair of glowing red eyes. Without thinking, they turned and ran again, this time heading deeper into the forest, desperate to get away. They didn't stop, didn't look back, until they were far away from the road, the cabin, and whatever had been in that car. They eventually found their way back to civilization, but they never spoke of what happened that night. The road, the cabin, the figure in the car, it was all too surreal, too terrifying. But the memory of those red eyes, glowing in the dark, haunted them for the rest of their lives. True road trip horror story script 2, The Deserted Highway. It was the middle of the summer, and Tom and Lisa were on their way to a music festival in a neighboring state. The drive was supposed to take about 6 hours, but they had left late and were now racing against the clock to make it before the gates closed. The highway was mostly empty, with only the occasional car passing by. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the landscape, and the temperature was dropping quickly. They had been driving for hours, and the monotony of the road was starting to wear on them. The flat, featureless plains stretched out for miles on either side, with no signs of civilization in sight. The GPS had long ago stopped providing directions, and their phones were out of range. They were alone in the middle of nowhere. As night fell, they decided to take a shortcut that would supposedly shave an hour off their travel time. The road was a narrow, 2-lane highway that wound through a desolate stretch of land. It was poorly lit, with only the occasional streetlight illuminating the road. The trees lining the sides of the highway loomed like dark sentinels, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. The further they drove, the more isolated they felt. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no end in sight. The darkness was oppressive, pressing in on them from all sides. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swept through the trees. After an hour of driving, they realized something was wrong. The road was supposed to connect back to the main highway, but they hadn't seen any signs or exits. The GPS was useless, and their phones were dead. They were completely lost. Tom tried to stay calm, but the unease in his stomach was growing. Lisa was visibly shaken, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. "Maybe we should turn around," she suggested, her voice trembling. Tom was about to agree when they saw headlights in the distance, coming towards them. Relief flooded through them as the car approached, but as it drew closer, they realized something was off. The car was moving slowly, too slowly for the highway, and its headlights were dim and flickering. As the car passed, they got a glimpse of the driver. It was an old man, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared straight ahead, unseeing. The car was old and battered, covered in rust and dirt. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Tom and Lisa watched in silence as the car disappeared into the night. A sense of dread settled over them, and they both knew something was very wrong. They continued driving, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of the highway or any other cars. The trees grew thicker, the darkness deeper, and the sense of isolation more intense. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. Tom cursed under his breath as he tried to restart it, but the engine refused to turn over. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service, no GPS, and no idea where they were. Lisa's panic rose as they sat in the car, the darkness closing in around them. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. They were completely alone. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Lisa saw something moving in the trees. It was just a shadow at first, but as she stared, it grew larger, more distinct. It was a figure, tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs that moved unnaturally. "Tom, do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Tom turned to look, his heart racing. The figure was moving towards them, slowly but deliberately. It was covered in shadow, its face obscured, but they could see its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Panic set in as they scrambled to get out of the car. They stumbled onto the road, their eyes fixed on the approaching figure. But as they looked around, they realized there were more of them figures emerging from the trees, surrounding them. They backed away, their hearts pounding, but there was nowhere to go. The figures were closing in, their eyes glowing brighter, their movements slow and deliberate. Tom grabbed Lisa's hand and they ran, desperate to get away from the figures. They ran down the road, their footsteps echoing in the silence, but the figures were relentless, following them, closing in. They ran until they could run no more, their lungs burning, their legs trembling. They collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for breath, but the figures were still there, watching them from the shadows. As they lay there, exhausted and terrified, the figures slowly retreated, disappearing into the trees. The silence returned, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind. Tom and Lisa didn't dare move, afraid that the figures would return. They stayed there, huddled together, until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. When the sun finally rose, they found their way back to the car. The engine started without a hitch, and they drove in silence, too shaken to speak. They eventually found their way back to the main highway, but the memory of that night haunted them for years. They never spoke of the figures, the glowing eyes, or the feeling of being watched. But they both knew that something had followed them out of those woods, something that would never truly let them go.